We're Quigley Motor Company in Manchester, Pennsylvania, and today we're getting a suspension upgrade on our all-wheel drive Transit camper van. After a fun weekend of camping with friends at the Mid-Atlantic Overland Festival in Huntington, Pennsylvania, we met our buddy Dave at Quigley headquarters in Manchester, PA for a tour of the facilities and to have the suspension upgraded on our Transit van. Dave also introduced us to Sean, the technician in charge of the work on our van. While I could have talked to Sean all day about the ins and outs of our van, I eventually let the man get back to working on our suspension upgrade. Dave walked us through all the components that were going to be installed. Because of the lift we had, the OE stud plate would also need to be replaced, along with the lower control arms, which were showing signs of premature wear. This is probably a good time to tell you a bit more about our camper van. This is the Storyteller Overland Mode LT, built on the 2021 Ford Transit all-wheel drive platform with the 3.5-liter EcoBoost engine. The GVWR is 9,500 pounds, and the interior is fully built out with a platform bed and garage underneath for additional storage. We've been traveling in the van since 2022 and have driven it over 36,000 miles. So we are having the Q-Lift put on by Quigley. The reason we decided to do this is we were getting some grinding, squeaking noise from the driver's side lower control arm. When we brought it in and they took it apart, we noticed where it was rubbing against the cradle. And part of that is due to the way the suspension arms were pushed down to create that original lift that we had.
With this setup, they're not lowering the cradle, but they're pushing the strut down and the control arm. So the sway bar end link doesn't change its position, and the hole normally it gets mounted here. But since they're pushing it down, they need to put this bracket on here to mount the top of the sway bar end link.
The reason we decided to go with the Q-Lift is because they keep that factory geometry up there. What they do is they take that front cradle and drop it 2 inches to give it a 2-inch lift, but it maintains the factory geometry with those control arms and most of the other parts of the driveline. They also drop the front differential and give it a little bit of an angle. And while they were doing that, we noticed that the current front drive shaft was actually starting to fail and it was spitting out grease. So we were able to get that replaced under our Ford warranty. Along with dropping the components 2 inches in the front, we're also getting new Bilstein struts. These struts also have a spacer, and they're going to allow the lift to be about 5/8 of an inch taller than what we had before. However, it still keeps most of the factory geometry up front. Here are the spacers that they added, and you can see where we get the 2 inches of lift. So they bring this whole thing down 2 inches and then put those spacers in so everything is even across the way. There's the front drive shaft, and they added a plate back here because what they found was if this drive shaft goes, it'll take out the transmission pan and everything back here. So they add this for extra protection. So this is the cradle that was dropped 2 inches. And right now, this arm is at full droop, which means it's the furthest it's going to come down. And when they lower the vehicle back on the ground, this is going to almost be level with this piece here. Now, with the other suspension, what it did was it pushed this arm down to create more of an angle here than being almost level. While that gave you more upward suspension travel, it limited the amount of downward suspension travel. So imagine these are your 2 wheels. As you go over a bump, if you go over a pothole, when it's pushed all the way down, the van is going to do this because the wheel doesn't have as much room to go down into that pothole. Now, because this is coming up and it's going to have more suspension travel down, when you go over that pothole, the wheel can go into the pothole, come back up, the suspension will do its job, and you'll have a much smoother ride in the cab. Yes, we could have just replaced that lower control arm. However, I'm guessing at some point, we probably would have had to have also replaced the passenger side. And we only have 36,000 miles on this van, so maybe in another 30,000 miles or so, we'd have to do it again. Now, with the suspension lift that was originally done in the rear, they had aftermarket shocks as well as additional leaf springs to help deal with some of the extra weight of the camper van build out. We're keeping those leaf springs, but we are upgrading the shocks to Bilsteins back there, and we are putting on these Timbren blocks. These are going to act as an additional, almost like a progressive spring, to help keep the van more stable on the road and hopefully drive a lot better. Here are the new Bilstein shocks that they installed, and this is the Timbren suspension component. When the van comes down onto the ground, this is going to be engaged with the Timbren full time. It's going to help improve the ride quality because this is always going to be working, and it's going to absorb a lot of those heavy hits and other things as we go over potholes. Now we have a long drive all the way back to Indiana, so it's going to give us a chance to really drive this thing and see what the suspension upgrades have done to the ride quality and everything else. We did get the chance to take out a Ford Transit with the Quigley 4x4 system on it. That thing drove great on the road, and it was like a little mountain goat when we took it off-roading.
Once Sean completed all the suspension work on our van, it went through an extensive quality control inspection before the van was moved over to the alignment bay. After all the work that was done on the suspension, we got an alignment that will restore the proper handling and stability of the van and ensure even tire contact with the road to prevent uneven wear. The final step was to reweigh the front and rear axles. Then we were ready to move back into our camper.
So the Q-Lift is done. Total install time was about a day and a half, and the cost for the Q-Lift starts around or just under $3,800 and goes up depending on what options you choose. For example, the Bilstein struts and the Timbrens would be add-ons to that package. Now, the one thing we haven't done yet is actually drive this thing. So I'm really excited to get in, take it for a drive. We're gonna tour around the area a little bit, see Gettysburg, and then head back to Indiana, and we'll share our first impressions of what it's like driving this with the Q-Lift versus the other suspension system we had on there before.
We drove a 2-lane country road over to Interstate 15 towards Gettysburg, or as the locals say, Gettysburg, where we spent the afternoon exploring the museum and cooking a meal in the parking lot. Kate found a buddy for the remainder of our drive back to Indiana, which included a scenic drive through West Virginia and a tasty barbecue platter of pork ribs and burnt ends at Red State Barbecue in Kentucky. With plenty of leftovers to enjoy at home, we made the final drive back to home base.
We're back in Indiana, and I'm going to go through the differences that we noticed having the Quigley Q-Lift on our van. Originally, we were expecting about a 5/8 difference in height on the front end of this over what we had before. I measured things when we got home and noticed that we gained over an inch of lift in the front end, and we were expecting about a 5/8. So I'm not sure why the difference there, but I will say the van sits a lot nicer than it was before, and it doesn't have that front rake that it did. The next thing we noticed is when we pulled out of their parking lot, there was a big dip there. And normally when we go over a dip coming out of a parking lot, the van likes to kind of wobble back and forth as we drive down the road. Well, it didn't do that. It was extremely planted and felt very solid when we came out of that parking lot. I think the reason for this is because the Timbrens in the rear are acting like a sway bar, keeping the body of the van from going back and forth, as well as the struts and shocks that are a bit stiffer than what we had in there before. Now, on our drive back, I was doing something I don't normally do. I was aiming for the potholes. I wanted to see what this thing felt like when we went over those big dips. And I will say it's smoother going over that rough terrain on the road because that front suspension now has more room to travel down into a dip than it did before. And that's generating a much smoother, more comfortable ride down the road. One thing Kate particularly noticed while we were driving is going through a parking lot and going over speed bumps or driving over railroad tracks at high speed. She noticed that the van felt like it absorbed the bumps a lot more, and it also didn't have that body roll that we normally get, especially when we go over the speed bumps in a parking lot. If we don't go over them exactly straight on, the whole van wobbles back and forth, and it doesn't do that anymore. Another big difference Kate and I both noticed is that in crosswinds, we weren't getting pushed around like we did before. I think a lot of that has to do with the body roll not being there anymore, and the van just felt a lot more planted on the road. Now, these are just my first impressions having driven from Pennsylvania to Indiana. Now, the other thing with testing this is going to be reliability, and that's going to take a while. The van had 36,000 miles when we brought it to Quigley, and as I mentioned previously in the video, we were noticing that noise and grinding coming from the lower control arm on the driver's side. Now, it's going to take a while to see what the reliability is like with the Q-Lift system, so we'll have to report back and let you know about that as well. We're going to spend some more time driving this around, take it off-road, and really see how this suspension performs over the long run, and we'll report back to you and let you know what we think. So that's it for this video. Let us know down in the comments below if you've done a suspension upgrade to your Sprinter, Transit, or another van, and what you think of it, and what you think has been the #1 top contributing factor to a better ride, if you got one. Thank you so much for watching. If you want more content and want to learn more about us, head on over to our website at we'retherussos.com, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
This video is sponsored by Quigley Motor Company.